Hovannisian is Distinguished Professor of Armenian and Near Eastern History and first holder of the Armenian Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of California at Los Angeles. He is also a Distinguished Chancellor's Fellow at Chapman University and an adjunct professor at USC to work with the Shoah Foundation. On the UCLA faculty since the 1960s, he organized both the graduate and undergraduate programs in Armenian history and has served as director of UCLA's Center for Near Eastern Studies. He has also served as a distinguished visiting professor at UC Berkeley, Cal State Fresno, Florida Atlantic, Clark University, UC Irvine, and USC. Professor Hovannisian is a Guggenheim Fellow. He's a founder of the Society of Armenian Studies and was 6 times its president. He represented the state of California on the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education and has served as consultant to the California State Board of Education, authoring the chapter on the Armenian Genocide in the state's social studies model curriculum on human rights and genocide. He has published 30 books, including 5 volumes on the Armenian Genocide. As well as his ongoing series on historic Armenian cities and provinces, he's perhaps best known for his 4 volumes on the Armenian Republic, his bibliography of the Armenian Holocaust, and a collection of essays he edited entitled Remembrance and Denial, the Case of the Armenian Genocide. This last I used several times in my Literature of Genocide course because of its focus, the clear light it sheds on the mindset and defensiveness of the perpetrators, not only during the physical violence, but in the century of virulent denial we recognize tonight. Tonight we're here to find out what we have learned, or should have learned, in 100 years. And I can think of no one better to learn it from than Professor Richard Hovannisian.
Dear friends, Professor Gukchin and colleagues, I'm really happy to be here after probably 20 years when the Society for Armenian Studies met with the Middle East Studies Association here in Portland. And I've been following this small community and nonetheless vibrant and very pleased that you've found your own social hall and church where an important gathering place. I'm never quite sure how to start when I talk. I don't have a prepared talk. But I do know that after 100 years, it's really strange because in our classrooms, 100 years is ancient history, even 50 years is ancient history. And in my own lifetime, I was born in the 1930s, the Armenian Genocide was ancient history, even though I was only a half generation removed from it. And today it's much more relevant to me and much more alive than it was decades ago. And it's an interesting phenomenon about memory. And how is it that memory perpetuates itself? Partly, as Dr. Gukchin pointed out, perhaps because of the denial, perhaps because we mature and begin to understand the enormity of what occurred. This past week has been a week of great emotion for most of us. I was in Yerevan, and it was uplifting to hear delegation after delegation from 40 or 50 different countries coming there to pay their respects and reaffirming their commitment to memory even if their own governments have failed to do so. And that's important. And we all know the excitement when His Holiness the Pope proclaimed, reaffirmed what everyone knows, that there was a genocide, and that sort of opened up the gates to other countries, including countries that were complicit in the Armenian Genocide. Austria and Germany, both of which were allies of the Turkish Empire in 1915, both of which were observers, witnesses to, and sometimes indirectly also participating in a number of cases, as the German artillery officer in Urfa who broke the defenses of the Armenians trying to defend them there by aiming his artillery at the Armenian walls and destroying them. Each of us who comes from a different background, and we come from many backgrounds, has a different experience with this topic. Those of you who were born in the Middle East have a different experience from those of us born in America. For you, the Armenian Genocide and Armenianness was always a part of your existence. For us, born in America, we had difficulties. I was born, as I say, only a half generation after the Armenian Genocide. In the San Joaquin Valley of California, where everyone was a survivor virtually. You know, unlike the Jews who have special organizations for survivors, or children of survivors, or child survivors, there are no such organizations among Armenians. There are no survivors of the Armenian Genocide organization because everyone was a survivor. And it was taken for granted. And I grew up at a time when women were still being rescued from the Syrian deserts, from Bedouins, and being brought to be reunited with their husbands who had come, if they were fortunate, husbands who had come just before the genocide to work for a couple of years, make some money before they went back home. Their families were left behind. They lost their parents, they lost, in most cases, their children. Sometimes their wives survived and then were taken in by Bedouins and lived with Bedouins and Muslims for 2 or 3 years, sometimes bearing children to those who took them in. And I remember these women who came across the United States, so I suppose it took 5 or 6 days by train, and there was a happy reception when they arrived, but they were scary for me because they were tattooed. They had medallions down the sides of their faces, and their lips were tattooed blue at a time when tattooing was not in for women. And so I grew up with those women. I saw those women. I was afraid a little bit of them, worried about them. And yet, there may be a few copies of my grandson Garin Hovannisian's book, Family of Shadows, back there, who has done a very good job at looking at my father, Kaspar's generation, who went through the genocide. Through my generation, born in America, who were never very confident about being Armenian, who lived in a rather prejudiced environment where we were encouraged to shed our ethnicity, our ethnic background, and to become as Anglo as quickly as possible and as white as quickly as possible. And so we were very uncomfortable. If our parents spoke in Armenian in the public store, we were a little nervous about such things. So we were not confident. And it took me many years, I should say. I grew up not knowing Armenian. I grew up being aware of being an Armenian, but for me it was more important to be an American kid. And that's what we aspired to be. And it took, as I say, some years of maturing to understand. And then the third part of this book, of Family of Shadows, is the story of the next generation after us. People who are our children, who are confident, who have been educated, who feel the great wealth of having the richness of an Armenian existence and a non-Armenian existence, being able to flow back and forth between languages, being able to flow back and forth between cultures, foods, cuisines, dance, whatever it may be. And it really wasn't spoken about. My father had a very sad childhood. He didn't have a childhood, and indeed, there is in Armenian quite a bit of literature about Manguchun Chunetzoch, those who didn't have childhood, and he was one of those who didn't have childhood, and yet, even though we lived for years together, I grew up on a small farm in the San Joaquin Valley with grapes, and we worked hard. He and his generation did not dwell on it, or if they did dwell upon it, they didn't share it. Perhaps because they didn't want to traumatize their children, and perhaps they thought that nobody was interested anyway. And it was not until the very last years of his life when I had started an oral history program, when I felt, after I had found my Armenianness, and it took me, as I say, it was not easy, but I found my Armenianness at one time. Oh dear, I thought I had shut that off. You know, I just told Greg that I don't have a cell phone. I don't have a cell phone, and therefore I borrowed one, and I should never have done that.
The one technological thing that works.
In any case, so it was not only at the end of his life that little pieces that I have known of all sort of came together. And here is a child in the province of Kharpert, which is in historic Armenia. In 1915, his father has been taken away, drafted into the Turkish army several months earlier, as were most of the Armenian young men at that time. And then they were put into labor battalions. They weren't given arms to fight, but they were put into labor battalions where they were worked to death, or if they were not worked to death, they were killed at the end of doing their job, whether it was building roads, building a tunnel, or whatever it may have been. Well, in July of 1915, the orders for deportation came from wherever they came from. And in the plain of Kharpert, there were probably 40 Armenian villages. And all of them, within 2 days' time, were up and moving. And I just, you know, for those of us who are so used to sitting on an airplane and going from one place to another, and I sat in Yerevan, and I was here it was 24 hours, but I was still here in 24 hours, or I sat this morning on a plane in Los Angeles, and I was here in 2 hours. It's some taken for granted, but imagine in a society where no one, especially if they're women and children, had ever gone more than 5 or 6 miles from their birthplace. They may have gone to a neighboring village, they may have gone to the marketplace, but that was their world. They lived there, their church was the center of their existence, and suddenly they're being put on a road, not knowing where they're going, being separated from their men, folk that remain, who in retrospect were fortunate because they were killed, most of them outright, within a day or two of their march. Whereas the women and children, strange how the perpetrator mind works. They could kill the men, but it was not chivalrous to kill the women and children outright. So you march them to death over weeks and months. Well, Kaspar was on that caravan with his mother, Hamanad, pregnant mother, and his 2-year-old brother, Capriel. And with thousands and thousands who were going first toward the Euphrates River, and then toward Malatya, and then to south, toward Urfa and to Delzor. And it was only by chance that he survived, because, and that again is the saga of many Armenians, just by chance, all these caravans of death were being raided continuously. You'd think that there's nothing left, and the last thing they took from the women were their clothing. And I tell my students, imagine, I don't know if you've been to Turkey or Armenia in the summer, in July and August, 100-degree weather, and being marched without any clothing at all. The last line of defense, the last line of humanity are your clothes. And those are taken from you as well, and you march naked and violated all along the way. And, well, in any case, Kurdish tribesmen spotted this boy, Kaspar, who was by this time 13 years old and not quite old enough to be taken with them and killed, but still a pre-teenager, a young teenager. And they say, hey, this is a good boy for working. We have sheep, we have goats, we have work to be done. So they take Kaspar from the death marches. They take him as slave labor, and his mother, Hernad, and his brother and all go, never to be seen again. Only some witnesses who survived can tell us what happened to some of these people. Genocide is not only murder, it's gratuitous cruelty. It's a celebration of death. And I learned very, very much later, maybe 50 or 60 years later, that my grandmother had actually been impaled on a sword as her death, her form of death, of being put onto a sword. Now in my older years, and I didn't understand any of this, by the way, in my youth, and I should say this as well, I think that victims of genocide never understood what happened to them or why it happened. They could never comprehend it. Why? We were just, common people doing our thing, and suddenly we're uprooted and driven. And so that generation of survivors I grew up, the only thing that they could do is to, what we call now essentialize, that is to simplify and say, the Turks are bad, the Turks are evil, they're genetically bad, and so that was the only answer. They couldn't understand what we now understand about, analyze about the rise of modern nationalism, the fear in the mind of the perpetrator in the case of the Roman Empire, who had lost so much of its territories, and the fear of this nationalistic group that gained power in 1908, the Young Turks, who then said, hey, we've lost all our lands, we're going to have to save what we have left, and what we have left is Asia Minor, and the way we're going to get that and save it is to make it uniform and homogeneous, with one nation, one people, one religion, one culture. The survivors didn't have that sophistication to understand what we now can understand about or realize about the mind of the perpetrator, under what circumstances genocide might occur, what are the characteristics, not only of the perpetrator, but of the victim. What was it about Armenians that allowed them to become victims? What was it about Jews that allowed them to become victims? What was there? There's a story. There's something behind it. Recently, someone said, and I thought about that, it's really true. 1915 was the beginning of the end of the Armenians, spatially, temporally, and ritually. Spatially, they were removed from everything that was familiar. From their room, from their home, from their school, from their church, from their priest, from their teacher, from the mountain that was behind their village, from their fields. They were removed from everything. So that removal from the space, familiar space in which we live, which is our lives, is already a destructive motion and devastation of the existence. But temporally means by time. Why were all the people killed? Why were all people victimized? I mean, they were the least possible to resist. And I think the answer is that the old people represent the Armenian past. And we want to destroy the Armenian past by eliminating them. And why were babies killed? Or why were they forcibly absorbed by the thousands, given new identities, given new names, converted by religion, forced to forget their language and their parents? Because children represent the future. And we want to destroy the Armenian future. And the women that we now mutilate, rape, destroy, they are the Armenian present. The men that we kill by the thousands we rope up. So we're destroying the Armenian past, we're destroying the Armenian future, and we're destroying the Armenian present. And on top of all of that, there's a ritualistic destruction of the Armenians through their continuous torment, dehumanization, mutilation, physical mutilation. We've seen enough now in recent times of beheadings. It brings me right back to 1915. Exactly. It's a ritual of hatred, a ritual of power, a ritual of helplessness of the victim. And so, spatially, temporally, and ritually, we have the victimization of an entire nation. On top of that, comparative genocide is very important. And they're not all the same. Armenians frequently want to piggy-tail, if you will, on the Holocaust, saying, well, you know, we had the same thing happen to us. But every genocide is different. There are things about the Holocaust that are similar, but things that are also different. The Nazis did not want Jewish children. The Nazis did not want to absorb Jews because there was this racial pecking order that they had. But the Turks wanted Armenian children because they had mixed with the local populations century after century, and they wanted to absorb these people into the new identity, and that's why we have so many thousands of little Armenian kids who are being forcibly absorbed. And that, by the way, is one of the features or the definitions of genocide, is a forcible transfer of children from one group to another, as exactly happened there, aside from the killing. But another difference is this. I can think of no other genocide in the 20th century, none, where the victim group is physically and legally prevented from returning even to visit the land of his ancestors. And throughout the 20th century, until just about the 1980s, Armenians were legally prevented from going back to visit their ancestral homes. And so there's this great divide that comes back, and they passed various kinds of laws in Turkey based on national security, border zones, troubled areas. You can't go there if you're an Armenian. Even if you're an Armenian who lives in Istanbul and are a Turkish citizen, you still cannot go to those lands in the east. And so here is this iron curtain that comes down that separates from the victim group, from all of its past, which is being continuously destroyed in these years, not only in 1915 to 1922, but my father's village in Basmashem, the church was there until the 1950s when it was dynamited. And so the destruction goes on and on. And the sad side of this Iron Curtain, and the sad side of denial, as I tell some of my Turkish audiences or people who come to question me, is it isn't it a shame that state denial of 100 years has prevented the Armenian people from acknowledging the good Turks. Because in nearly every interview that I've done with a survivor of the Armenian Genocide, there was some form of intervention. Some people who intervened, Turks or Muslims, who intervened for an hour, a day, a month, a year, but nonetheless, that intervention saved their lives. And they were not all like my father's case, where the intervention was not altruistic or for simply moralistic purposes, because my father was exploited. But there were those who really felt that it was against the precepts of Islam and tried to help. My father was able to run away. He heard that the Russian army had gotten to Erzincan and Erzurum, and a man by the name of Antranik, a famous Armenian hero, had arrived there and fled, I don't know how, over the area known as Dersim with Alawi Kurds, and ended up in Russia in the Russian Civil War, being imprisoned for a time, I don't know by whom, Reds or Whites, and ending up back in Constantinople and finding his way to Ellis Island at the end of 1920, when they asked him, "What is your name?" You know, Ellis Island registers are just terrible. You can find the same last name spelled 20 different ways, depending on how they're hearing it. So when they asked my father, "What is your last name?" he gave them not our family name at all. He said, "My name is Hovannisian." The reason was that his father, Hovhannes, who had been taken to the army and killed, in his honor, my father was taking a new name, his father's name. Well, what shall I say? With all of that I've just described, with all the horrors that I've just described, with these women coming with tattoos to Fresno, and when I think now, the only therapy that we had on our farm in Tulare, we had these little farms, they're 18 acres, 20 acres each, and the women would always work in the fields, or they would go to the canneries where they made preserved foods. But in the evening, about 6 o'clock or so, they would all sort of gather, and I remember coming under our shade tree. We didn't have air conditioning, so no one would sit inside during the summer. You sit underneath the shade tree, and they would drink what we called Turkish coffee. And at the end, besides doing their fall, you know, the fortunes, they would talk to each other. And they would laugh and they would cry because they were recounting their own experiences through those terrible years. And when you think about it, it was their therapy. We had no therapists and others who could help these people, but by talking to one another, it was mainly the women who spoke, and some of them obsessively, but most of them very reservedly. But the other side of this is, if you've grown up with that generation at all, you're just amazed at how resilient they are. Because 15 years after they had lost 3 children in the death marches, where they may have lost their wife and had to marry another one and try to create a new family, they still know how to sing, and they still know how to joke, and they still know how to dance. And when I think about if I lost my children a decade ago, could I bring myself to sing and dance? And so it was their determination to go on, to survive, to overcome. And I think that's probably true of all survivors. Strong, they have to be strong to continue. All of this was my experience without understanding the phenomenon of genocide. And the calculations of the perpetrator side, in this case a Turkish government, in the 1920s, 1930s, was a very well thought of strategy. And that is, if we can silence discussion of the Armenian Genocide for one generation, for another 30 years, until the witnesses and survivors pass from the scene, then we are home free. Then we can take over all of this enormous wealth that we have taken illegally with no compensation. We can take over everything, we can rewrite history, and there's no one that can challenge us. Because in a court of law, they'll say, were you there? Were you a witness? Did you see it? No, but my mother told me, my father told me, I know this is a true story, but I'm sorry. It doesn't count. And so that strategy was not to be, as they're doing today, all kinds of denial, but suppressing discussion. And the very best example of that, I'm sure you know it, is the attempt to film the celebrated novel of Franz Werfel, The 40 Days of Musadagh. A saga, a very long one at a time when there was no television, a time when people read, and a time when families went to the movies every week. And this was going to be this novel, which was a story of a defense, successful defense, one of the few Armenian successful self-defense efforts of 6 villages near the Mediterranean Sea, outside of historic Armenia, but near the Mediterranean Sea in a place called Musadagh, which means Moses' mountain, the biblical. And Franz Werfel made it even more biblical by calling it the 40 days. You know, 40 is very biblical. The 40 Days of Musadagh. It was a blockbuster, and MGM bought the rights to the film. They had already prepared the script for the film. They'd already chosen who their actors were going to be, and the Turkish government got wind of it, immediately intervened with the United States Department of State, talking about good relations and how this would, if this film were made, how it would strain and muddy the waters between these two countries that had now reestablished diplomatic relations, that it would have a very detrimental effect on American business in Turkey, that American films would probably be banned from Turkey if this film were made. Well, it didn't take much cajoling of the State Department to get involved, even way back then in the 1930s, to contact the motion picture producers and distributors of America in Hollywood, which saying, you know, this is an issue here. I mean, what can be done? You know, State Department doesn't say don't do it. It says, you know, this is a problem. You know, what can you do about it? You know, it could have a bad effect on our relations here. And so the motion picture producers then went to MGM, which after some negotiation agreed to send the script, the prepared script, to the Turkish embassy in Washington, for them to redline what would be offensive to them. But they came back saying everything is offensive. And so you probably know the story that it was shelved. This is 1930s. And that is a part of that strategy of silence. Don't allow any discussion. And that's why today there's really a difficulty for the Turkish government, because the window has opened up a little bit, because Turkish scholars are now challenging the state narrative, because there's discussion, public discussion of what's going on, And that's very dangerous because when you open the window this much, it can go here. And therefore, you have to keep it shut as tight as possible. Well, by World War II and the Holocaust years, the Armenian Genocide, which was known to the world far more than the Holocaust was, by the way. You know, we think that the Holocaust was, front page news. It wasn't. It wasn't. The Armenian Genocide was front page news.
At the time it was going on.
At the time, in every major newspaper, and look at the New York Times, and you'll find in the year 1915, I don't know, 100 and some odd articles, many of them front page. So, because of this long-term Christian association between American Protestantism and Armenian evangelicalism, schools, hospitals, and American institutions. So there was a long-term. So there's far more known about the Armenian Genocide at the time, even though we didn't call it genocide, but deportations and massacres. And the word, by the way, Holocaust, was used repeatedly at the time of the Armenian Genocide. Well, so the Armenian Genocide had nonetheless become, by the time of the Holocaust, virtually a forgotten genocide. Virtually no one knew about it when I was in high school. Certainly there was nothing ever written about it or spoken about it, even in courses of world history in the university. And like many of you, I myself also, whenever looking at a book, go to the index immediately, look for the word Armenia and Armenian. Frequently disappointed in not finding it, or else finding it in a passing references to the Romans conquered 7 countries, A, B, C, D, and Armenia. That's the extent of it. Things changed. 2 things changed, I think. One was the unexpected Armenian sort of self-discovery that occurred on the 50th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, 50 years ago, 1965. What was left of Armenia was a little sliver of land that had been a part of the Russian Empire, never a part of the Turkish Empire. It had become a Soviet state. And because of Soviet-Turkish relations, it was impossible to commemorate the Armenian Genocide in Soviet Armenia. It was always downplayed. But in 1965, there was this spontaneous, unprecedented outburst of fury in Armenia that had never been seen anywhere in the Soviet Union. Because in the Soviet Union, if you lived there, you know that even 3 or 4 refuseniks or demonstrators are swept up from the street in 5 minutes. But what do you do with 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people who come into the streets? And at the same time, without any planning, I think, the same occurred in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in Sao Paulo, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Paris, in Tehran, in Beirut, in Aleppo, everywhere the Armenian world exploded with self-realization and anger and frustration. And on top of that, I think what brought us into understanding the phenomenon of genocide, along with this, was something that wasn't related directly to the Armenians. It's what we call the Eichmann trial. Eichmann was, as you know, a Nazi war criminal who had been living in hiding in Argentina for many years. It took the Israeli secret service to break all the laws, to capture him, kidnap him, and spirit him away. I don't know how they did it, but leave it to them. To Israel, where he was tried in a public trial, where the whole world learned about the Holocaust. For the first time, really, that was a watershed. He was publicly executed, not publicly executed, but executed. And that Eichmann trial brought about a great deal of attention to the Holocaust. The Holocaust studies have always been there. Holocaust survivors have always been there. But world sort of scholarly attention had not really focused on the phenomenon. And that began in the 1960s and the 1970s. And where we, as you well know, if you've done any work with the Holocaust, you know there are thousands of works on the Holocaust, on every aspect that you can think of. I mean, if you're a PhD student, you have really a hard time finding something that hasn't been done. Unlike the Armenian Genocide, which is still in its infancy. But what I want to say is that sort of opened the way to understanding the phenomena, the mind of the perpetrator. Who is the perpetrator? What are the fears of the perpetrator? What is the role of modern nationalism? Exclusive modern nationalism, where you identify ourselves as against the other, even if that other is your own brother, your own citizen in a sense, living in the same country, having the same citizenship as you do, but they are the other. Who identifies the other? This ultra-nationalism that puts a certain group outside what is referred to as the universe of obligation. A government has no longer any obligation toward this group, even though it's its own citizen, because it's been defined as the other. We all know in Nazi Germany, the Jews at one stage who had gained all these civil rights in Germany, had been integrated into German society, had been contributors to German culture and society for decades, come to a point where they are identified as the other, to be outside the universe of obligation, even though they're your own citizens and contributors to you, and as such are expendable. And then we also look at, when does genocide occur? Under what circumstances? What are factors that go into it? And this is where our scholars, first Jewish scholars and then other scholars who believe that the genocide, the Holocaust, while having its singular aspects, cannot be seen singly alone, but has to be seen within the broader context of mass killing. Always keeping in mind that each genocide has its own characteristics. And we find that there's always, almost always, not always, a significant difference between the victim group and the perpetrator group by religion, by culture, by whatever it may be. That the victim group is always scapegoated for the weaknesses of the state, of the society. You blame the other. You blame the Jew for the economic crisis of the 1920s and 30s. You blame the Jews for the spread of communism because all the leaders of Soviet Russia are communists. You blame the Armenians for the loss of territory by the Ottoman Empire. You blame the Armenians for having exploited their positions to take over the economy at the expense of these wonderful, tolerant Muslims who don't live as well as the Armenians. Scapegoating, blaming continuously the other. The role of modernization. We can't say that it's just modern nationalism, xenophobic nationalism, which is hatred of the other, fear of the other, or just modernism, which has its factor. In modernism, I mean creating or establishing the means of destruction, more effective and efficient means of destruction. They may be the gas chambers, or they may be the railway, or they may be, in the Armenian case, the telegraph. The Ottoman Empire is a backward country. It's not developed, it's not industrialized in 1915. But guess what? It has a telegraph. And guess what? The chief perpetrator of the Armenian Genocide, the organizer, Talat Pasha, is by profession a telegraph operator who keeps tabs province by province, town by town, what's going on. And when he writes to a governor, to a valley, saying, tell me who it makes up the population of your town today. In other words, how many Armenians are still there? And if there are many Armenians still there, why are they there? And so modernization gives us the means. I mean, modernization is wonderful. We're, as I said, Yerevan one day and Los Angeles the next. I'm of a generation that saw running water come for the first time in my grandmother's house. I remember the first rotary telephone that came into the, I mean, these are really, and the first washing machine. My mother used to use the scrub board. Have you done that? And look where we are today. And with all this wonder, we've also created the means of mass destruction that can be put into the wrong hands and used in the wrong ways for mass violence. Vulnerability. Victims have been proved to be vulnerable prior to genocide. And it's clear to the perpetrator's side, who's going to take the most extreme measures to make a final solution, that they can do this with great security and impunity, because they know that no one will do anything. Look at the Armenian case. There had been an Armenian question in the Turkish Empire in the 19th century. Armenians had begun to ask what blacks in the United States started to ask in the 1950s and the 1960s, and that's not a good question. It's a three-letter word. And you probably know that the word I'm talking about is why. Why are we not equal? Why do we have to, if we're Armenians, why do we have to go to the side of the road when a Muslim cart comes? Why are the Kurdish tribes waiting for us to pick all our crops, work all year, and then come down and raid our villages and take away not only our crops, but our young women? Why isn't there security of life and property? Why? Why are we second class, officially second class? Even though we may be living better than our Muslim neighbors, but officially, according to the Islamic precepts, we're second class. We're the Gyavur, we're the infidel, we're the non-believer. That question became known as the Armenian question in the Ottoman Empire. And the inadequate and sporadic reaction of the European Christian powers to it made things worse rather than better for the Armenians. But the point is that in the 1890s, under the last major sultan of the Turkish Empire, whose name was Abdul Hamid, between 1894 and 96, many thousands, some would say 300,000, some would say 200,000, some would say 100,000 Armenians were massacred, starting in the coastal city of Trabzon, and I have Trabzon in one, I bought a couple of books on Trabzon, starting on the Black Sea at Trabzon, and spreading to every province of historic Armenia, lasting 2 days, 3 days, 4 days before the regular army would intervene to put an end to the mayhem, to teach the Armenians a lesson. The Sultan didn't want to kill all Armenians, he needed them. But he did want to teach them a lesson, not to get out of place. What did the world do? The world described it, missionaries wrote about it. The whole Punch magazine in London had these caricatures of the bloody Sultan with blood, blood on his fingers and so forth. But what did we do? Well, the Americans are good at collecting nickels and dimes for orphans and widows. That's what we did. But at the very next year, the German Kaiser was in Constantinople, Istanbul, to visit the Sultan. Nobody did anything. This was peacetime. So why in World War I, when the whole world is fighting, when thousands of people or millions of people are mobilized and thousands of people are dying every day, who's going to now intervene to help the Armenians when we decide to take the final solution by using the cover of war? And that's important. I don't know if there would have been an Armenian genocide if there had not been a war. I don't know. I don't know if there had been a Holocaust if there had not been a world war that provided the cover for them to take the most extreme solution to a problem which they perceived. Would they have been so daring? But they knew, in the Jewish case, the Jews had been placed outside the law already in the 1930s. Those of you who know Holocaust history know that they have been disenfranchised, that they've been kicked out of the universities, out of government jobs, one act after another. Laws that would prohibit sexual relations between Jews and Gentiles. And then in 1938, in November, Kristallnacht, when they burned the synagogues and holy books, and I saw these when I was a little kid. I remember we used to, the movies in those days, had these little newsreels for like 5 minutes or 10 minutes before the main feature. And I remember seeing the burning of Jewish books, holy books. And so what did we do? I mean, it wasn't applauded. It was, it was horrifying. It was horrifying, but what? So if we're not going to do anything then, and as you well know, Europe in 1930s went after appeasement, giving things away to Hitler in the hope that he'll be satisfied, when he would never be satisfied. He knew what he wanted. So if you're not going to respond in peacetime, then of course the perpetrator knows, as the Young Turk regime knew in 1915, and as the Nazi regime knew in the 1940s, that it could take the most extreme measure, final solution, and not be called to account. Economic transfer of wealth. And these are some of the factors in genocide. Just imagine the enormity of the Armenian wealth, personal wealth and collective wealth, from businesses and farms to churches and schools. Each of these volumes I do on historic Armenia is really painful for me because I collect pictures to put into them. And in every volume, the picture of these beautiful young girls with their white dresses, graduation dresses, and their white ribbons. And the young men with their ties, not like our current students with torn pants and t-shirts. Serious. And then you see graduating class of 1912, graduating class of 1913, and you know what's going to happen to these people in a year's time. It's very, very painful. But the enormous, every genocide is characterized, every one of them, by this huge and massive transfer of wealth from one group to another group. In many cases, the use of extra military special organizations. And again, if you're a Holocaust person, you know the word Einsatzgruppen. The special organization. Special organization. Just look at that. How that translates from the Turkish Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, special organization. What's a special for? You know? Well, on the surface, it's supposed to be a special organization to help the war effort. But the real reason is to organize the mass killings of the Armenians by letting prisoners out of hardened criminals out of prison, and by organizing tribesmen. And again, a difference between the Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide is that most Germans didn't see the killing of Jews. Whereas in the Armenian case, the killing was in the open, face to face, with massive, massive public participation. Because they were backward tribesmen and so forth, and told, hey, You know, these people are exploiters. Whatever they have is yours. And that's why these poor caravans of women and children were attacked night after night, day after day, until they had nothing left except their bodies. And those then were violated and mutilated. I don't want to be morbid, but I want to say that we have learned a lot. We've learned a lot away from the time of those tattooed women who could not understand what happened to them or why it happened, could not understand the perpetrator, didn't understand anything. Now we understand. I'm not saying that we've done much about it, but we understand the phenomenon. But maybe there's hope, a little hope. There have been a number of international tribunals that have been created. Not terribly effective, but better than nothing. In The Hague for the former Yugoslavia, in Arusha in Africa for the Rwandan genocide, now in Cambodia, finally after how many years, 25 years, 30 years, finally now creating courts, even though most of the people are dead, there are still a few old people, but it's a moral statement. Just as after World War I, there were trials in Istanbul of the chief perpetrators of the Armenian Genocide, even though they had all fled the country. But it was a moral statement when they were convicted of the crime and condemned to death, even though it was in absentia. And even though nobody did anything to execute those verdicts except for Armenian vengeance seekers who had to go out and one by one track down those people who had been condemned to death and to pull the trigger themselves, and that should not have been necessary. It should not have been they, but it should have been the legal system. Nonetheless, those courts-martial were an important precedent, just as we're finding Nuremberg was. It didn't solve things, but they're statements. And with the modern Court of International Justice and others, maybe there's hope. And I think that the positive of all of this is, if I went to school without ever having heard of any of these things, my students today are aware. My students today, not all of them, but they're willing to organize for Darfur. They're willing to, many of us have not even heard of East Timor probably, but at a time when the Indonesians were in occupation of East Timor, student activism was there. And I think the real challenge is to teach that we're not threatened by differences, that we could be enriched, that differences make up a bouquet, and that we have this wonderful bouquet, and why should we shun this bouquet? I'm going to end with, I don't even have the quotation, but it's something that I think is meaningful to me at least. In 1982, when I heard that in Tel Aviv, for the first time since the trials, the Eichmann trial, and many conferences that had taken place in Israel after the Eichmann trial, but the first time there was going to be a major international conference in Tel Aviv on all genocides, including the Armenian Genocide, including other problems, Cambodia, and so forth. I was then active in an association known as the Armenian Assembly of America. And as a person that was also in academics, I was able to encourage 7 or 8 scholars, almost all of them Armenian or else married to an Armenian, to submit abstracts and to go to this conference in Tel Aviv. Most of the papers had no political content at all. They talked about how the Armenian Genocide is reflected in literature, it talks, different aspects, philosophy and so forth. And it's interesting where we've come talking about this subject on the side. When I was drawn into the field of Armenian genocide studies, there were probably no more than 10 books that I had a recourse to in English language. Today, that's been multiplied 20 times and 30 times over. We have 300, 400, 500, if not more, including numerous memoirs that have come forth. So it's beginning to blossom. But at that time, in the first volume, when I think back on it, every paper in the book that I published titled The Armenian Genocide in Perspective, every paper was aimed at trying to demonstrate that a genocide had occurred. It was descriptive narrative. You know, the New York Times says this. Well, this is, I do a history of the Armenian question. Fact. Yes, there was a genocide. That's where we were coming from. Because it was still an issue that was unknown. And that was my 5th volume I've done. You know, we've really come a long way. We no longer talk about the facts of there was a genocide, there wasn't a genocide. We do the analysis of it. We try to understand it. We understand things like transgenerational trauma. We try to understand the various philosophical aspects. You know, asking a question. Why is it that Christian clergy and clerics for so many years have been in dialogue with Jewish theologians, trying to understand the role of Christianity and the failures of Christianity during the Holocaust, and yet I still don't know of any Muslim Christian dialogue relating to the Armenian genocide and the silence of the Muslim religious establishment. I'm not being racist at all, it's just, you know. So we've come a long way in that, but in this first volume, it was sabotaged. The conference was sabotaged, 1982. Because when, I think it was Haaretz, wrote a description of the forthcoming conference that was going to be sponsored by Tel Aviv University, Yad Vashem, the memorial, and some governmental ministries. The Turkish, just as in the case of Musadag, the 40 days of Musadag, the Turkish government immediately became involved, engaged, and pressured the Israeli government to cease and desist. At first, they didn't get too far, and then they sent a delegation from Istanbul of Turkish Jews to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem, saying, you know, this is not going to reflect good on us. It can have a very bad negative impact on the remaining Jews of Turkey. And finally, the trump card that I learned later from Israel Charney, who was one of the major organizers, was that the Turkish government had blackmailed Israel further. Remember, this is 1982. Remember Iran in 1982, the Khomeini revolution had just taken place, the Islamic Revolution. And thousands of Jews were leaving illegally, in an underground, and they were coming out through Turkey, and then going to Israel, to New York, or wherever else they were going to go. And the threat was that they were going to seal the border to not allow that illegal flight of Jews out of the country. And at that stage, Elie Wiesel, who was the honorary chairman, withdrew from the conference, saying he could not put Jewish life at risk. At the same time, he would not be associated with a conference that did not include the Armenians. Yad Vashem withdrew its participation, others did. The conference went forward with about half the people that were going to be there. And as it happened, you know, things worked in a strange way. If you've been to a scholarly conference, you know that there are 15 panels going on at the same time, and if you get 10 people, any one panel, you're lucky. Well, this attention to the Armenian case caused such that the room such as this was overflowing by people wanting to know what's the big deal, what's this all about. When I came back, I edited those papers, as I say, the first volume I did, and I asked a member of the U.S. Holocaust Council not Jewish. His name was Terence Dupre, who was a Cajun, actually, professor of English, to write the introduction. He wrote a very effective introduction. And what I remember best is the conclusion. He quoted someone who was then an exile Czech, intellectual, Kundera, Milan Kundera. And Milan Kundera had said some things that Terence Dupre added to, and that is that great powers often try to diminish peoples whom they've conquered and over whom they rule. And they try very hard to eliminate the foundations of their culture. And that sometimes the result is sadly genocide. This is against power. We strive and we fight as best we can. The cardinal point, the most important point in this struggle against power is the weapon of memory against forgetting. And so I think that's why we're here tonight, is for memory against forgetting. Thank you.
Other questions? We have an agreement to take a few. Anyone have a question? Yeah.
What happened to that script, NGM script?
Oh.
It's still there, unpublished. It exists, and there's actually a dissertation now being written by one of our students at UCLA on that whole story of Musadal. And there's also another book, a full book that's been written on that by Hovannisian, who was a professor at one of the colleges in Oakland, California, on Musadal.
So
But it's still not a film. The rights to that film were bought by an Armenian group
There is a film.
some time ago, and they made what, not a very good film that I think found a pretty good audience in Japan.
Is it because of the
Yeah.
still?
I'm sorry?
Is still a bad idea to make that movie, or?
No, there is no plan to my knowledge. It comes up. I have. It was interesting because there was a screenwriter living on my street about 20 years ago. He said that we've written the whole script all over again, and I assure you it's going to be made. A German company is investing, I don't know, 10 or 20 $million. And they even asked me, they wanted to get a better name for the heroine, which was more difficult. I've forgotten what the heroine's name is, but it was not so easy to say. So I came up with the name Lucine. You know, it sounds good. It's easy to say. So, you know, I get these continuous assurances, but nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. Yeah.
What do you think about, Armenian, Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Committee?
About the Conciliation Committee, I think it was
You are not a
misused.
member of it.
I'm sorry?
You are not the member of it, I think.
No, I'm not a member of it, but the problem with the Reconciliation Commission is that they're not reconciliation. When you create a Reconciliation Commission where the Turkish side is made up of Turkish diplomats or former diplomats who are the mouthpiece of the government, you know, you need to get third party, you get second track diplomacy, where citizen to citizen, scholar to scholar. That makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad you said that, because it's really now encouraging also that we have 20, 30 Turkish scholars who are very much engaged in trying to know the truth, who are able to tell us things that we could never know by ourselves, because we don't have access and we don't have the skills to do that. But they're able to tell us now, for example, why was it that in Diyarbakir, Dikranagir, 100% of the Armenian population was annihilated, whereas over in Kütahya, way over in the west, maybe 2%. So it means that there's a lot of difference going on the ground, despite the overall overarching policy of the government. Individuals on the ground make a big difference. If you are sort of a dyed-in-the-wool Ittihadist or Young Turk in Diyarbakir and you're sent there to kill, you do it with great pleasure, and that's why there are very little people. And also the transfer of wealth from Armenians to Kurdish families there, well-known Kurdish families were in Diyarbakir. But in other areas, the death rate is less. Why is this? You know, the policy is the same. And so the Turkish scholars are helping us to understand this, and also allowing us to understand that there were really some conscientious Turkish officials who truly opposed this. But this reconciliation commission you have mentioned to was created some years ago, which was supposed to be second-track diplomacy, but really wasn't. And if you have government officials or former officials in any kind of dialogue, you know, obviously they're answerable to their government, and they're not going to do an honest response. Yes. Yeah.
Sir, you mentioned the word hope this evening. Are you hopeful that the State of Israel, international Jewry, will ever see the Holocaust center stage to Armenia?
Yeah, I'm
Will the United
hopeful.
States help?
I'm hopeful. And this was the time to do it, especially if they've been knocked around with every insult by the Turkish president. But they have their own calculations. I find it difficult to criticize Israel when I should be criticizing the United States of America and the president who's made promises about acknowledging, but goes halfway, but still goes around the circle. As you probably know, the president of Israel recently did participate in an Armenian commemoration. That is not the state, obviously. And it's especially for Israeli scholars, and there were some in Yerevan last week, they feel truly insulted that a victim people refuses to acknowledge the victimization of others. Having said that, let me also say that the Armenians are often not very sensitive to the genocides of other people or the victimization of other people, and should be more sensitive to these issues than they are. They've sort of been so forced by denial to concentrate so much of their energy. And that's another, you see, that's another negative. Armenians are bound together by a negative common denominator, and that's not good. Recognition of the Armenian genocide is the thing that everybody wants. That's the lowest common denominator and connects. Whereas the Armenians have survived through centuries, not by mourning the past, but by rebuilding, by new culture, new churches, new thing. And this effort for recognition has stymied what could be done in the artistic world, in the creative world, in the architectural world. Not that it hasn't been done, it's done, but so much more could have been done, I think. Yes.
My question is kind of two parts. So one is, what do you see as the goal now? Is it just recognition to get the Turkish government to recognize? Is it any other?
Who determines the goal of what you want?
Yeah.
Everyone wants something different. I would say that the common denominator for everyone is acknowledgement of what went on. Many Armenians, third, fourth generation in Fresno, my relatives, they don't want to hear about land or property or anything. They just didn't want. They want the truth. They don't want to have the Turkish government lying about they want the history books to tell the truth. They don't want to go to Turkey and find a monument for the murderer. Can you imagine going to Berlin and finding Hitlerstrasse, Hitler Boulevard, or Himmler Gasse? I mean, that's what they have. And so they want an end to that, setting the record straight. Now, many will go beyond that and say that's not enough, because even in the most forgiving of religions, there is some degree of penance that is required. If you're a Catholic, you do confession, and then you're asked to do some penance, whether it's mea culpa, I've sinned, and penance. So what is the penance that is going to be required? I think that really is where states come into being. I don't think that Armenian diasporans, every one of us here can have a different idea who is Armenian. And therefore you need an establishment such as the Armenian state that has to take the lead. And one of the things I complained about in several of the interviews I had in Armenia was that we have not determined what we want. It's easy to say I want all my land back, but you know, how realistic is it? What is your most advanced position and what is your fallback position? Have we defined that? And I think we're sort of moving in that direction now, but it's still in a formulative period.
So what can people here do to
Well,
forward those on?
to keep memory alive. Keep memory alive. And I think that's the main thing, to educate, to inform, you know, to personalize it. I have a sick wife who is so traumatized by 1915 that she cannot see a baby without thinking about the babies on the death marches. She has, if she sits on a plane, she has to talk to the person next to her about the Armenian Genocide. And I'm the opposite. You know, I don't want to talk to anybody. Leave me alone. So it depends on the individual, but certainly making known, preserving memory, and saying, hey, you know, there is a lesson to be learned. The Armenian Genocide should not be learned and remembered simply as an Armenian tragedy. The Armenian Genocide must be remembered in the way that the Holocaust, and only the Holocaust, of all the genocides that have occurred since the beginning of the 20th century, only the Holocaust has entered into collective human consciousness. It has been integrated into human history. You cannot read a history of World War II without having some discussion of the Holocaust. So it's been integrated. There is no other of the 20th century that's been integrated into human history, and that's a challenge, because there's much to be learned from the Armenian Genocide, in many ways as being a prototype. And that's another reason that the old women, they weren't so old then, but the women I grew up with, could never understand what happened, because there had never been total elimination of a population in modern history. There had been, you know, killings, massacres, pogroms, but the concept of total annihilation was new. So we have a lot to be learned from it.
I would like you to offer an opinion as to the probability that another 3 million Armenians may be extirpated or exterminated if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. Who will prevent a caliphate who will wake up one day and go, why are we allowing a Christian nation in the middle of all this?
Well, I don't think that Iran is the danger here. The Iranians have lived quite well with Armenians for 400 years. But it could be the reaction of another country taking, what is the word that they use? Not preventive action, but some other kind of action that could do what you're talking about. And the other, and it's not on our subject, but the other is that Armenia has to get its act together, the country of Armenia, and its economy back together, so that people will not want to leave, but will want to stay and develop as they really want to, but sometimes feel that they cannot. Yeah.
Dr. Hovannisian, thank you for coming and sharing with us your insight. A question, in Middle East, 50 years ago, 23% population were Christians.
Yeah.
And now, while we're speaking, genocide is taking place.
Yeah.
And in California, we have 600,000, 700,000 Armenians.
Right.
All we hear about,
Yeah.
save Aleppo, save Syria. What Christian community is doing to prevent the genocide that's happening today?
They're not doing much because they feel that they can't do much in the face of this violence and fanaticism that they're facing. They are a minority. They're a minority, and they've tried to, be good citizens and sort of keep out of politics, but they're dragged into politics. We're fighting a continuous de-Christianization of the whole Middle East. It's an issue. It's an issue, and I have no answer to it. Again, just trying to pressure our government. Again, though intervention without being well planned can be worse than no intervention.
100 years ago, most genocide survivors went to Syria.
Yes,
They settled in Aleppo.
yes,
These are the poor people now are
are being victimized.
victimized again,
Again.
and nothing is.
And that again is a continuation of the genocide because they're put into a position where they can be victimized again as a minority. And Aleppo is particularly painful.
That's right.
It's the mother community of the Armenian diaspora, the mother community. And it's just, very painful, especially the whole Middle East. If the Armenian language, literature, knowledge of culture has been maintained, it's thanks to those communities. Because we're not able to do that here, except to do it in English translation. And obviously you're losing things in any translation. So, anyway, I want to thank you. And again, I hope you'll take some books so I won't go home with books, and especially Family of Shadows. Get one, you'll appreciate it.
Thank you very much.